In this lecture, we're going to look at the liver and gallbladder. So today we'll start off by looking at the surface anatomy, the position of the liver, and then go on to explore its gross anatomy. So we'll look at the anterior and posterior view. We'll look at lobes, fissures, and the porta hepatis. We'll look at peritoneal relations and the coronary ligaments. We'll then look at the blood supply and venous drainage of the liver, and we'll look at functional lobes and hepatic segments towards the end. We'll also look at the gallbladder, various parts of the gallbladder, its position against the liver, and the biliary tree and how it connects with the pancreas and the duodenum. Now, the liver is the largest gland in the body, and because of that, it is vitally important in maintaining the internal environment. It performs a whole number of functions, including various aspects of metabolic activity. Importantly, it stores glycogen. And for digestion, it produces bile, and we'll look at that in more detail when we look at the biliary tree and the gallbladder. So the surface anatomy of the liver we looked at briefly when we did the surface anatomy lecture right at the very beginning of this course. So here we can see the liver is positioned within the abdomen, and it's actually covered by quite a few of the ribs. We can see we have ribs 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all protecting this right lobe of the liver. And it's quite difficult to palpate the liver because it is actually tucked under these ribs. We can see it's existing up in the right hypochondriac region, and it extends all the way across the epigastric into the left hypochondriac region. We can see its relation. It's slightly anterior to the stomach here. It covers the duodenum, and it's also related to the hepatic flexure of the colon. So the liver, this very large gland sitting directly underneath the right dome of the diaphragm, mostly in this right upper quadrant of the abdomen. As I've mentioned, it's the largest gland in the body, and it's positioned in the right hypochondria, the epigastrium, and sometimes the left hypochondriac regions. It is inferior to the diaphragm, specifically the right dome of the diaphragm. And the liver is made up of 4 anatomical lobes, and these are important, 4 anatomical lobes, not functional lobes. There's the left, right, caudate, and quadrate. There's also 2 functional lobes and 8 hepatic segments. These are really important, and these lobes are different to the anatomical lobes. The anatomical lobes are really named after what you can see and various fissures that separate the liver into various parts, left, right, caudate, quadrate. But they have 2 functional lobes based on branches of the hepatic artery, and these functional lobes can be further divided into 8 hepatic segments, which we'll explore later on. The liver is suspended within the abdomen by peritoneal ligaments, primarily via coronary ligaments that suspend it from the diaphragm. And I've mentioned the numerous functions of the liver, its metabolic activities, storing glycogen and producing bile. Let's have a look at the surface features of the liver which we can see. This little man here is indicating the gross position of the liver, but we can see that this is going to be down the right side, so we have this nice large right lobe of the liver. We have this much smaller left lobe. So on this anterior view of the liver, we can see the diaphragm up here, and we can see right and left lobes. We can see that these right and left lobes are separated via the falciform ligament. And this is a really important ligament as it connects the liver to the anterior abdominal wall. So if we remember the peritoneum, that's attached to the anterior surface of the liver, this visceral peritoneum, that's going to be running all the way across the liver. In this direction, it's running all the way across the liver. We can see it here, and we can see it here. And then, when these 2 parts of the peritoneum come together, they unite and then extend to the anterior abdominal wall. So here, they're just uniting and then extending towards the anterior abdominal wall. And that forms your falciform ligament. We can see the same happening up here with the coronary ligaments projecting to the diaphragm. This helps to support the liver in its position. If we imagine the anterior abdominal wall is here, and this is the liver, which we can see here, and then spanning the anterior abdominal wall towards the liver, we have the falciform ligament. Then here, where the falciform ligament finishes, we have what's known as a free edge. So this is your liver, this is your anterior abdominal wall, and this is the falciform ligament. And we can see that spanning is the falciform ligament, and its free edge is a structure known as the round ligament of the liver. And this is really important because this ligament used to be a patent blood vessel. It used to be the umbilical vein that allowed blood to pass into the developing fetus from the mother's placenta. And blood passed through this free edge of the falciform ligament within the round ligament of the liver now, within the umbilical vein. It would then run up the posterior surface of the liver, which we'll see in a moment. So here we can see the posterior surface of the liver. We can now see again, we have this right lobe that's over here, and we have this left lobe, which is here. But we can now see for the first time, left lobe, larger right lobe. We have these two other lobes positioned here and here. One positioned next to the inferior vena cava, the other positioned next to the gallbladder. So we can see that this one that's positioned next to the inferior vena cava, this lobe here, is known as the caudate lobe. This is the caudate lobe. This is the third of those anatomical lobes. We then have the lobe that's positioned next to the gallbladder, and that is the quadrate lobe. And we can see the quadrate lobe is here. So we've got these right and left lobes, and between them we have the caudate and the quadrate lobes. There's a fissure between the left and the caudate and the quadrate lobe. So this fissure running down here is an important fissure as it contains the round ligament of the liver. It contains that round ligament of the liver, which is now going to run up in this direction. And it becomes, as it's running on this posterior surface of the liver, the ligamentum venosum. It just changes its name. And ultimately, this would be taking blood, oxygenated blood from the placenta. It would bypass the liver, and this would go directly into the inferior vena cava. As we no longer have the placenta attached since we were born, this patent blood vessel, this umbilical vein, becomes fibrosed, and then we're left with the ligamentum venosum. That's running in this fissure between the left lobe and the caudate and quadrate lobes. Between the right lobe, so this lobe over here, and the caudate lobe, we find the inferior vena cava, and between the right lobe and the quadrate lobe, we have the gallbladder. The gallbladder is storing bile. Between the caudate and the quadrate lobe, we have this region here, and this region is known as the porta hepatis. If you remember the portal triad running in the free edge of the lesser omentum in the hepatoduodenal ligament, it contained three structures. And those three structures are now passing towards this opening at the liver, this kind of gateway to the liver that allowed these vessels to pass in and out. So at the porta hepatis, we find the same three structures that were in the portal triad. We find the hepatic portal vein, which we can see here. We can see the hepatic artery, which we can see here. And we can also see the bile duct, which we can see running out here. These three structures passing or leaving to and from the liver ultimately then run in the portal triad. Remember, in the free edge of the lesser omentum. And that's how these structures can pass into the liver or away from it. If we move on to the peritoneal relations associated with the liver, these are important in enabling the liver to be suspended from the diaphragm. If you remember, this is a superior view looking down onto the liver. Then this is posterior here, this is anterior here. Then again, we've got these layers of peritoneum that are running along the surface. So we've got visceral peritoneum running along the surface. These two layers converge and then migrate towards the anterior abdominal wall here as the falciform ligament. These two peritoneal layers. They also come up in this direction. They also extend up in this direction. And that's what we can see on this other diagram over here, where it's passing upwards and it's passing upwards. Now, over here, we'd have the diaphragm. So this image here is projecting the diaphragm, and then the coronary ligament running over the surface of the liver then reflects to the diaphragm to then run along the underside of the diaphragm. And we have two of these. We have one running around here, and we have one running around here. And this ligament here and this ligament here form the coronary ligaments. This coronary ligament has got this anterior and a posterior layer. An anterior layer here and a posterior layer here. Remember, the peritoneal ligaments have these two layers to them. So this is the anterior and posterior layer of the peritoneal ligament. We can now see that the liver is actually suspended from the diaphragm. We can see now that we have this space that doesn't have any peritoneum, this space on the liver that doesn't have any peritoneum adhered to it, because we've got this reflection here and here. No peritoneum here. And that means this region of the liver is known as the bare area. There's no peritoneum attached to this bare area. There are some other ligaments that attach the liver to the lateral, to the right body wall, and to the left body wall, to the diaphragm, and these are known as triangular ligaments. Where this bare area here doesn't contain any peritoneum, where this anterior layer of the coronary ligament here converges with the posterior coronary ligament, which will be round underneath here, we have left and right triangular ligaments, where these anterior layers of the coronary ligaments converge at the extreme. Together, the coronary ligaments and the triangular ligaments are important in suspending the liver from the diaphragm, from the body wall, holding it in place. You also have the inferior vena cava running up through the liver, especially along its posterior surface, and that helps to anchor the liver in place also. So now let's move on to the gallbladder and the biliary tree. So this diagram we've seen many times before now has the liver lifted and we've exposed the stomach and the lesser omentum. And we can see that the liver on its visceral or its more posterior surface has the gallbladder attached to it. We can see the gallbladder here, this little sac. The gallbladder has a fundus right at the very tip that's poking out from the undersurface of the liver. It has a body and it also has a neck. And that neck gives rise to the cystic duct. Again, we can see we have a fundus down here in this isolated diagram showing the component parts of the gallbladder. We have a fundus here, we have a larger body, and then it tapers down into this neck. The neck is then continuous with the cystic duct. We can see the cystic duct here. And what's happening is the hepatocytes within the liver are producing bile. Now, this bile needs to be stored and it's concentrated, and it does that within the gallbladder. So up here we have the liver, and we have our left and our right hepatic ducts. These converge into a common hepatic duct, which unites with the cystic duct, and this allows a pathway for bile that's been produced in the liver to be stored in the gallbladder. So bile is then transferred from the liver to the gallbladder. Now, it usually does this by passing all the way down to the duodenum first. So here we've got the bile duct. The bile duct formed by the union of the cystic duct here and the common hepatic duct. Where these two unite, we find the bile duct. So what's happening? Bile is produced in the liver. Bile then runs all the way down through the bile duct towards the duodenum. If the sphincter that's guarding this major duodenal papilla is closed, then the liver will continue to produce bile, but instead of being released back into the duodenum, it's going to pass all the way back up and go into the gallbladder. So as bile is passing down in this direction, so if it's closed, the entrance to the duodenum is closed, then it will pass back up and be stored in the gallbladder. This means within the gallbladder it can be concentrated, and then when needs be, an outflow of bile can then enter into the duodenum, say once you've eaten a particularly fatty meal. And this relationship forms part of the biliary tree. When we look at the pancreas, we'll consider the inputs from the pancreas via the pancreatic ducts. So, bile is stored and concentrated in the gallbladder, and this is if it becomes overly concentrated, overly dehydrated, can lead to gallstones. So if we look at the blood supply to the liver and to the gallbladder, then this is primarily going to be from the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk, which is this branch that's coming off the aorta. We spoke about it last when we looked at the blood supply to the stomach. And we can see that the liver is going to be supplied by the hepatic artery. Now, the hepatic artery provides only about 20% of the blood supply to the liver. It supplies the nutrients and the oxygen that allows the liver to function. Just like every organ that needs oxygen needs nutrients, this is carried out by the hepatic artery via the celiac trunk. But the liver actually receives the majority of its blood via the hepatic portal vein, about 70-80% of its blood from the hepatic portal vein. This is blood that's come from the gastrointestinal tract. So it's blood that's received the digested nutrients that you've eaten from the food, from the fluid that you've consumed. It then passes it to the liver, which then undertakes these metabolic activities. What we can see is that the hepatic artery quickly divides into left and right branches that will go on to form the left and right functional arteries that supply the left and right functional lobes. So these left and right hepatic arteries will supply the functional lobes of the liver. We can also see we have a small cystic artery that typically comes away from the right hepatic artery, although that can be quite variable. It passes to supply the gallbladder. We can also see running posterior to the hepatic artery, so posterior to the hepatic artery within the portal triad, we have the hepatic portal vein. This also will split into two portal veins, and that will go to the left and right functional lobes of the liver. Here we can see next to the hepatic artery and the hepatic portal vein, we have the bile duct, and now we're seeing our portal triad once again. Once the blood has gone to the liver then needs to pass that processed blood that's containing now these processed nutrients that have been worked on by the liver, that the metabolic activities have carried out, have cleaned the blood, essentially made it fit for the systemic circulation. This blood now passes back into the systemic circulation by a series of hepatic veins, and these drain directly from the liver into the inferior vena cava, which then quickly passes through the diaphragm and enters into the right atrium of the heart. So I spoke about functional lobes and liver segments and why these are particularly important. Well, on here again, we can see we've got the right lobe, we've got the left lobe, we've got the caudate lobe, and we've got the quadrate lobe. And these are our anatomical lobes, what we can see separated by fissures. But within these anatomical lobes, we can actually see two functional lobes based on the blood supply, based on the branching of the hepatic arteries. Now, we can roughly say that the two functional lobes, the left functional lobe and the right functional lobe, equate to the left anatomical lobe, the caudate, and the quadrate. They together form the left functional lobe, and the right anatomical lobe can pretty much be the right functional lobe. So these Two functional lobes will receive a left hepatic artery and a right hepatic artery. They'll also receive a branch from the hepatic portal vein. Within each of these functional lobes, the whole liver is then divided into 8 hepatic segments, and we have 8 hepatic segments. Each of these individual segments will receive its own branch from the respective hepatic artery, will receive its own branch from the respective hepatic portal vein, and each of the segments will have its own biliary and venous drainage. So essentially, each of these hepatic segments can work in isolation. This has big repercussions when you're talking about segmentectomy or lobectomy during liver surgery, when portions of the liver can be removed, knowing that that part of the liver that's remaining has an adequate blood supply via the portal vein, hepatic artery, and an adequate venous biliary drainage. So the fact we have anatomical lobes and we have these functional lobes and hepatic segments is really important for liver surgery. So in conclusion, we've spoken about the liver and the gallbladder. We looked at the position of these organs within the abdomen, and then we explored their gross anatomy, both the anatomical lobes and their functional lobes, what we can see on the anterior surface and what we can see on the posterior surface. We then looked at various peritoneal ligaments, the coronary, triangular, falciform ligaments, and specifically the falciform ligament containing the ligamentum, the round ligament of the liver, which used to be the umbilical vein. We looked at the porta hepatis and how it had similar structures to the portal triad, hepatic artery, hepatic portal vein, and the bile duct. And then we looked at the gross anatomy and the formation of the gallbladder and the biliary tree.